Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the 97 UX Things podcast. Dan Berlin here, your host, and I'm joined this week with Cindy Brummer, who wrote the Personas with Emotions and Behaviors Are More Valuable. Welcome, Cindy.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Glad to be here.
Could you please take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my whole role as a UX designer is as a leader of the agency I run out of Austin, Texas. It's called Standard Beagle. I've been doing that plus teaching, and recently got my master's degree, so having a fun time.
Excellent. So, could you tell us a little bit about your career trajectory? What how'd you get started in UX, and how'd you wind up where you are now?
Oh man, it has been a long, winding road.
Yeah.
When I first started, which, gosh, it's been over a decade now, I started off as a web designer,
Hmm.
making a transition from the world of journalism. I was a TV news producer, and in my most recent TV job, which was back in, gosh, 2005, I was a web producer, and that's when I really got introduced to the whole idea of doing websites.
Yep.
And I had always loved design. In fact, in high school, I did, yeah, newspaper design. And I figured out, wow, I could do this. I could do this, on the web. This is super, super cool. So I cobbled together quite an education
Hmm.
through some, local community college classes, through conferences and books and magazines. And then all of a sudden, someone started asking me to do websites. And from there, really, that's when it kind of started to take off. I ended up leaving TV, tried to make a go as a freelancer. Didn't really work, but I got a job doing website design and development. Was the only person doing it at the company I was at. And then ended up just still having that entrepreneurial bug and made my own like opportunity. So created an agency, started working with clients, growing that. We're a small boutique agency now, and I get the joy of helping other designers. So I do a lot of just mentoring and overseeing the stuff that we do, and working with developers as well. So it's
Yep.
been awesome.
You had mentioned the cobbled together initial education. Can you tell us a little bit about what you studied and to help you get to this career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I took some basic classes in HTML
Hmm.
and CSS, thinking that I was going to go down the road of being a developer. I took some graphic design classes, learning how to, master like how to put together headlines around images and things. I ended up reading quite a bit of the Smashing magazine library of their white papers and ebooks, and that's really what kind of got me into it. I started reading a lot on Search Engine Land, which is
Yep.
still around, and just the one thing that I really loved though was I was reading A List Apart, which is that blog, and then they had a conference, and I went to the conferences whenever I could afford it, and they came to Austin,
Yep.
and that was phenomenal. It was the whole, like everything. It was the design, it was the content. I got really into content strategy and information architecture, and so it was from listening to experts and reading books. So I mean, I read Steve Krug's. Don't Make Me Think. And I went to every talk I could find of Jared Spool's, like when he came to South by Southwest, and I was
Yep.
like seeking out the leaders, and that's how I did it.
Gotcha. Great. So can you tell us about your chapter?
Yeah, so I wrote about developing effective user personas. And part of the reason I decided to talk about user personas is because as an instructor, I'm teaching others how to do it. And I get a curriculum, and I kind of started handing it to them, and I didn't really think about it, And you see a pretty picture with some demographics and some stats. And then I started looking at it, I'm like, these are not useful at all. They're not helping people make the right decisions about what to do. How is this possibly what can help us develop empathy for the people that we're supposed to be designing solutions for? So, what I really wanted to do is kind of in the chapter show here's what we're doing typically. We're typically creating a snapshot, an avatar, but it's not as useful as we think it is. And what makes it more useful is thinking about the holistic qualities of a user, which is not just their demographics. I don't care how old necessarily someone is unless it's actually really relevant to it, because if you think about people who are shoppers in a grocery store, it doesn't matter how old they are. We all have to go to the grocery store, right? But really focusing on the relevant information, the things that are, what's important to them, what are their pain points, what emotions are they feeling, and even like, because we're so varied as people, like even thinking about the fact that our emotions vary depending on our context. And so I wanted to kind of set like a difference there between, like, here's what we typically create and here's what would make it better. Here's how we can level it up and how we can get there. So looking at the data, like what are we asking in our interviews to find out more about the people that we want, to help create this persona to help us develop these products. Um, what what relevant information can we learn from them, which also helps sharpen our user interview skills to make sure that we're asking about their emotions and getting into the root of the issue there.
Mm.
Because ultimately, we do want to understand users' goals. We want to understand their frustrations, because that's how we make decisions about what we're creating for them. It's not about whether they're 62 years old and, like, drive a Tesla, not necessarily, not all the time. It's about, they have a specific need, like, they're angry about some sort of issue that's going on, and that we need to solve that problem, because that's ultimately what we're there to do.
Hmm.
you know um and so I wanted to talk. There's so much stuff I had to leave out of the chapter just for, the sake of space and
Sure.
everything. And I wanted to go into what inspired me about it from, Alan Cooper's book About Face, where he describes the persona and how you should be thinking about it in terms of goals and frustrations. Because I think a lot of times when experience practitioners are going in and they're taking boot camp courses, there's a lot of like, look, here's a template, follow this and this will like solve your problem. But really there's a deeper understanding and learning that needs to go into it, and why we do this as an industry, as a practitioner, why we create these and why it's so important to do that.
Hmm.
So
Would you say it's interesting you say templates, because we want to apply? It's easy to we want to apply templates to things because it's easy for process, right? Is there a way I wouldn't say make a template for this process, but to make a process that's malleable to do what's right for personas?
Oh yeah, that's such a great question. The process for me is like answering the questions, in terms of like adding it to the template. I'm still
Hmm.
figuring out the best way to make it into a snapshot, almost like a picture for people. But making, like, I've started adding a section to include behaviors
Okay.
and context around them. So how does the user act when they're at home versus they're at work versus they're at the gym versus they're driving on the road?
Yeah.
What are those behaviors? And then what are the emotions that they're feeling at that time? Because, you know, s- and I like to think back of, like, as like, say I'm a patient, say I need to see a doctor. Me calling someone up or looking for a doctor when I'm feeling healthy may not be the same emotion that I'm feeling if I'm not feeling good. If I'm like, if there's an emergency situation, say, or if there's some sort of situation where I'm in pain, that context is very different, and the
Right.
emotions I'm feeling are going to be different. And I feel like as practitioners, we need to think about the fact that people are different
Right.
depending on the day.
Absolutely. They're a person's state of mind. If they're agitated and have high anxiety, their short term memory is going to be lower. They're not going to have, they rightfully shouldn't have, don't have patience for things. Completely different.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's those kinds of things that, we tend to kind of put the sunny side
Hmm.
on personas and think
Absolutely.
about, like, the happy path. But I feel like it's equally important to think about the negatives,
Right.
just even think about the consequence of not having enough sleep and
Right.
how that affects us.
Hey, and hey, that's another chapter in the book. Don't always design for the happy path. I
Right.
forget whose that was, but that's another. Hey.
Yeah, exactly.
So you answered the question I was going to ask, but I want to get a little deeper there of why is gathering emotions so important? And we started down that path in terms of like state of mind and context. What else in terms of emotions is important there for design?
You know, I this is something that, like a lot of times, we want to paint the sunny face on like how people act, but when people get angry, we don't always know how to be prepared for the negative emotions.
Hmm.
And when we're not prepared, we don't know what to do. Say if the user's angry with our product, or they're angry with our website or some sort of service.
Hmm.
And I think if we can think about all the emotions that humans feel, or at least our users are feeling, we may not necessarily have to design it in at that moment, but maybe it can help us with our strategy of the overall customer experience,
Yep.
of thinking about how, like, if a user's going to call in, they might be angry, and how do we help calm them down without saying calm down, ma'am?
Right. Right.
Which
Right.
can either inflame them even more. And I think that that preparation gives us a lot more insight into how to communicate with users, and even think about how to be sensitive to their needs. Just thinking about, we're at the time we're recording this, it's June, and we're thinking a lot about Pride, and Juneteenth is coming up, and just how are we communicating with all kinds of groups of people, and what are they
Yep.
feeling at this time, that we can be sensitive to
Hmm.
them, and maybe change our communication to, the tone might change depending on the context of it.
Right.
And being prepared for that, I think, is really important.
And how are you learning about this from your participants and users? Is there when you're doing your research, is there a way that you're going about that's a little different than say the traditional way of gathering personas?
Well, for me, I'm the kind of person that's very curious, and I like to ask
Hmm.
as much as possible. Some people are afraid to go deep with their questioning, and I think maybe I'm not as afraid, mostly because of my journalism background, which has taught me to dig deep no
Right.
matter what. But there's a sensitivity that comes to it as well, of making sure that the user that you're interviewing is okay with it, so that they feel comfortable, and you're developing that rapport. I think a lot of times, at least in my practice, at the very beginning, I didn't want to take a lot of the user's time. I wanted to condense that interview. Everybody's busy, right?
Sure.
But the thing is that when you're interviewing someone, it takes time to develop rapport and
Yep.
get somebody to feel comfortable enough to share those things. And so I think if we can spend more time with a user, talking to them and just listening,
Yep.
instead of trying to rush through an interview or rush through a usability session, where we're really listening to them, they're more likely to share these types of things with us.
Absolutely.
And that's the big difference, I think. Don't rush.
Yep. Yep.
Listen.
And even when it does get into a place where they may be uncomfortable, it's still an opportunity to not make assumptions. You may be talking about a tender subject with a participant. They may be crying because it's a tender subject, and our assumption would be to end it. But they don't necessarily want to end it. They want to just no. I just want to. I'd like to talk about this. This is helpful. So we have to challenge our assumptions.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the times that I think we all feel a lot of challenge in just being quiet.
Mm,
And I think as interviewers, that's actually the biggest thing that we can do, is acknowledge and let them speak, instead of trying to soothe and end it, like you say. Just listening,
yep.
and letting them finish it out, and also helping them feel safe, that it's okay to share. You're not, as an interviewer, I'm not going to go broadcasting this out on YouTube, what they're saying and feeling. So if they feel like it's a safe thing, they're more likely to continue sharing. especially if I'm not interrupting them.
Right, right. That's what I always say. Just sit there and shut up and listen.
Exactly.
Aside from interviews or workshops or even surveys, are there other research methods that you employ for this? Anything else come to mind?
For me, it's sometimes it's just sitting and watching people. I don't think that you know, a lot of companies give us a lot of time to do those
Mm,
ethnographic observations,
yep.
which are very, particularly in the time of COVID, the pandemic made it
Right.
really hard to observe. But every time I can, I encourage my students and the people that I work with to just watch, go where they are. Go
Right.
and see how they act, because you can get a lot of information just from the different places if that's a possibility of
Of
just
course.
watching people,
Nothing better
you
than
know.
watching people in their natural environment.
Yes.
Yep.
But it's the tried and true. And sometimes I haven't personally used diary methods,
Hmm.
although I've seen it done. And that might be, over time people kind of write, and they may reveal more
They
at
do.
those different times of
Yeah, they
day.
definitely do. Diary studies are wonderful for that sort of thing, especially if your experience is more longitudinal, right? It's not just a website that you're visiting. You're going to have this relationship with the experience. It's great for gathering that data.
Yeah, and I can't say for certain that like automated methods don't work, but I know I've had better luck understanding emotions when I'm talking to someone, or when I'm
Absolutely.
in human presence, rather than relying on automated tools to do it for me. There's a place for them, for sure, but the emotions don't always come out unless they're in anger or the extreme emotions,
Right. Agreed. No, absolutely. I agreed 100%. There's nothing like talking with people to really get at the root cause of why a design should be in a certain trajectory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So you mentioned there are some things that you didn't, get into the book because of the length of the chapter. Anything else you wanted to bring up here that is worth mentioning in terms of the personas in your chapter?
I wanted to share a ton of resources
Okay.
in
Yep.
the chapter in terms of personas. I'm a huge fan of Alan Cooper and all of his books, since he introduced personas. And I found that one thing that really inspired me was there's a book by Eric Meyer about context in design, and he gives this whole example about some of the like some of the messaging on Facebook back in the day being very insensitive
Hmm.
to the context of, say, a user who might have gone through a death in the
Oh,
family
right. Yep.
and not thinking about it. Or he gives this example of being a father whose daughter was being air flighted to a hospital, and then like being completely panicked and in the car looking at a mobile site trying to figure out like the information, and literally being blinded to it. There was
Yep.
just so much other stuff. And I think it's important to think about how users perceive what we create in like being able to look at it through that lens of, if they're blinded by rage or some sort of strong emotion, that things are going to be different. And sometimes it's just a matter of creating like a spreadsheet where we just kind of brainstorm all of the things that might be going through our
Yeah.
head. How would we feel if we were in this situation or in this situation? And how could it come across? How can we make this experience better for all of the particular personas that come to our site?
Hmm.
So, yeah, that's it.
Now, one of the let's say original ideas of a persona was to draw in your stakeholders. That's why we made them in pretty well laid out and with visualizations, that sort of thing. Are there strategies to continue to do that in your personas for drawing the audience in, or visualizations that are good?
Yeah, so still love using some sort of image, that somehow showcases who this person is. Although sometimes I think that it's not necessarily going to be a stock photo that does it.
Hmm.
I like showing some sort of image of the person, of say a person that kind of is our persona representation, and they're doing the thing
Mm.
that we are thinking of them doing, not just a smiling, pretty picture, but maybe they're at the gym, working out, or, I think in the book I used the plumber example.
Yeah.
And so maybe they're that person that's standing there in the bathroom with the water spraying behind them or something, just to kind of remind us like exactly what we're thinking of.
Hmm.
I saw some wonderful designed examples of different personas and, for a grocery store chain here. In this area that I live in. And it was just so great how they drew you in and they told a little bit of a story, and then they really focused on their goals, their frustrations, their pain points with an image to represent it. So I think sometimes we get bogged down in the demographics of figuring out all the little pieces of where they live and how old they are, and you know s- all the grandchildren, cars, all the things that happen around us, when we really need to focus on bullet point examples of like what are their main frustrations and what are the things that they're trying to achieve,
Yep.
which can draw people in and remind us, that's exactly what they're supposed to do too, is just remind us what we're trying to achieve
Yep.
as designers.
Yep. And there may be reasons that demographics do affect those behaviors and emotions. I mean, it's not to say they aren't cut out. And there may be patterns in those demographics that we find in the long term, but they're just one piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of it being the main piece that we focus on, making sure that it's a part of
Yeah.
it, and not relying on assumptions, because I think that
Do your
the
research.
danger, yeah, doing the research is really important.
Hmm.
I can think back to one example that I saw in a classroom setting, and it was so full of assumptions. And when I asked, where did all this come from? None of it had come from research.
Right.
It was all from their own personal assumptions. And we can't do that.
Right.
That we should absolutely not do.
Right.
It has to be valid research.
One question I have to ask, because we're talking about personas, is what's your thought on alliterative names?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with it per se.
Mm.
If it doesn't become cutesy and take away from the overall mission of what we're trying to accomplish.
Hmm.
Um, I think I'm more against, coming up with random names that may exclude groups of people that should be part of the persona, because names can matter, right?
Great
Like,
point.
so if we have like a female name, but really it's not as important to distinguish between the genders or any of the genders, I think if we choose a name, we have to be careful. We have to think about those kinds of things too.
Yep.
It might be better just to kind of describe the behavior rather
Hmm.
than come up with those names, like
Yep.
the entertainer or something
Right.
like
Right.
that, you know?
Great. So,
Yeah.
in the last part of our podcast here, I love gathering pieces of information for UXers. What's that one piece of advice that you'd like to convey?
I stagnated as a designer by not
Hmm.
getting feedback.
Yep.
I should have a long time earlier. And now that I'm, even though I have some experience, I know I don't know everything. And
Hmm.
just from reaching out and talking to other designers, putting myself out there, I feel so much more advanced in my skill. And then also, gosh, this community is just so great about sharing and helping
It is.
everyone. There's nothing to be afraid of in
Hmm.
terms of saying, "Hey, I'm new. Help."
Yep.
I wish I'd done that. I wish I'd
Yep.
done that.
Great. Well, any other last thoughts here about the piece of advice or your chapter?
No, not on either of those. The book is so full of great advice, and I'm so honored to to have a chapter
Great.
among all of those other wonderful pieces of content. It's so great.
Well, I can't thank you enough for being a part of the book and taking the time to chat with me here. Cindy Brummer wrote the chapter on ensuring emotions are in your personas. And this has been the 97 UX Things podcast. And thanks for tuning in.